one. I got with me today Dr. William V Massey. He is a researcher and a teacher here at OSU, and he works with how play shapes and helps youth who have experienced trauma. And we'll get right started off with what do you hope to accomplish with your work? What would you like to see in the future?
Well, first, thanks for having me, Tiger. It's a pleasure to be here. I think in terms of thinking about the work that I do and what we hope to accomplish, I think a broader picture, one of the things that's important to consider is that play is fundamental to childhood. And so, even if we think of the United Nations Declaration that play is a fundamental human right for children, that shouldn't be taken away, alongside decades and decades of research that show that play is instrumental to how children learn, how they develop, their social development, emotional development, psychological health, physical health. And so really what we try to do is think about how we can create environments that make play and physical activity conducive to some of those benefits. Particularly you mentioned kids who have experienced trauma, and when we're thinking about situations where kids have had trauma or adverse experiences, environments can be incredibly scary depending on how they're structured and who's in them. And so a lot of the work that I do is focused around school and elementary school and recess in particular. And so if we think of the recess environment as a whole, it's a place where generally we think like, well, that's the most fun of the school day, right? That's the part of school that everybody loves because you get to go out and you get to have fun and play and do everything else. At the same time, for a kid who's experiencing trauma and adversity outside of school, it can be a terrifying place. So we know that recess is also the number one place that bullying occurs in elementary schools. It's often where fights occur. It's the number one place where exclusion occurs. And so for a kid who has a dysregulated stress response system, which is characteristic of someone who's going through adversity at home or in the community, not knowing what's going to happen in this big space with hundreds of kids, having no structure, having no advocate or support system can be incredibly scary. And so big picture, what we want to do is promote the idea that physical activity and play is essential for kids. It's probably even more important for kids who are experiencing trauma or adversity or adverse experiences. And so we need to make it accessible in a way that's beneficial for them where they're at.
Yeah, and when I've spoken to you in the past, I kind of got the sense that a lot of the foundation of trauma is having a lack of control or control taken away from you, feeling powerless. So I'm curious how you incorporate that into a better recess in the future.
Well, so if we think of trauma, adverse experiences, there's been a lot of work in that realm. And so if we kind of back up to like the biological mechanisms, and there's a lot of research that's been done on what are called adverse childhood experiences.
Such
neglect,
as?
Abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, having a parent incarcerated, living with a parent with mental illness. And what happens, just, the short of it is that you have a dysregulated stress response system, right? And so
What does that mean for the average?
Sure. So you have, if you think about our normal responses to something, to stress, and we think of like our primitive responses, most people think of like the fight or flight, right? And so like you see, you're out hiking in the McDonald forest and you see a cougar, right? Like the body is going to send off a series of hormones and chemical reactions to say like freeze, right? Like pretend you're a rock, don't do anything, or run, get the heck out of here, get to safety.
Or fight.
Right? Or fight, attack, right? Yeah. And like have to be ready to go. So you're going to get flooded with like adrenaline and all of those different hormones that make your body ready to do that.
And
right?
that would be a well-working response system.
Well, so it's adaptive, okay. Right? If you have to fight a cougar in the forest, like you're not going to want to feel pain. You're going to want to be flooded with those hormones so that like basically it's a survival instinct, mm-hmm. Right? What happens when kids have, or adults, anybody, have a dysregulated stress response system, is that you've now associated different things with the cougar, right? And so like you might see, like there might be something in an environment that triggers that response where now you get flooded with this stress response system, but it's inappropriate.
Such as a more complex thing, like what would be an example?
Let's say that you are a child who is abused by their primary caregiver, right? So at home you get physically beaten all the time, and that person is tall, just say. And every time you see a tall person, your internal system is telling you abuse is coming, fight or run, right? And so you're constantly being flooded with this response that there is danger, right? So I might be a kid out at school and all of a sudden, like, we have a new teacher out there who's really tall, and my biology is telling me, shoot, this person's scary.
Yeah.
Like, this person is going to cause harm. When in reality, right, a normal regulated system that is not disrupted by trauma or adverse experiences, like you see the tall person, you might not think twice about it. But for the kid who's experiencing trauma, they're gonna see cues in the environment that are otherwise unthreatening, see them as threatening.
Yeah.
And so I think, I know you asked about control, but first to think of there's a biological response that's happening, right? And so like on a basic level of our biology and physiology, there's things that are happening internal to the person that that aren't going to be happening in a child that's not being affected by trauma, that's going to cause adverse experiences.
Do you think having those being triggered all the time creates chronic anxiety and depression?
So it creates a whole host of things, right? It compromises immune function. It increases your risk for being obese by like 2 or 3 times. It increases your risk for stroke. It increases your risk for cardiovascular disease. It increases your risk for mental health issues, right? So across the biopsychosocial spectrum, individuals who have experienced trauma in their childhood particularly are at a multitude of risk for all of those things. And a lot of it is because of that biological system and how it's functioning and how it's changing, our hormonal system, our immune system, our responses to different events, how cortisol is always being flooded through the system. That's changing a whole cascade of health issues. And so we know that, individuals who've experienced trauma in their childhood are at a greater risk throughout the entire lifespan, not just in their childhood, for a variety of physical, psychosocial.
And so where you fit into this is you believe play is a core component, not the entire picture between therapy and all these different components, but a vital component in fixing that, solving that, healing that, or what's?
Well, let's not use fixing, because, I think then you kind of get into language of like, this person's broken and they need to be fixed. I think fundamentally play is something that every child needs to develop in a healthy way. If you look at school-based intervention, so if we're just talking about school in general, there's 2 main types of interventions that schools can have that are more like trauma-focused, trauma-sensitive, right? One is addressing essentially the disrupted regulation system of a child. So if you think of like a lot of kids who experience trauma are diagnosed as kids with ADHD. Behaviorally, the symptoms might look similar. The underlying biology and mechanisms are different in terms of what's happening, but the kid who's affected by trauma can look very much like a kid with ADHD in the classroom, right? So they're dysregulated. They have poor behavioral and emotional control. They don't sit still. They don't follow tasks and assignments very well. They disrupt others. And so one piece of helping with that is creating systems and structures that are very predictable, so that kids can have an opportunity to regulate their behavior in a predictable structure. I promise I'm getting to the play piece.
You're good.
Another part is interventions aimed at helping with the disrupted attachment. And so oftentimes trauma is interpersonal. And so that kind of goes back to your original point of there's a lack of control, right? If I'm a child who's being abused by an adult, control, autonomy is being taken away from me, right? But within that, there's a disrupted attachment. And so we know from a child development perspective that one of the most important things for children to have healthy development throughout the lifespan is that they have a secure attachment with a primary caregiver. When that's disrupted, say the primary caregiver is, like there's neglect or there's abuse or there's maybe the primary caregiver is depressed and they have an inability to connect. Maybe there's circumstances going on where, they don't have the capacity per se to really attend to the developing child, and the attachment is disrupted. There's a need for that, and so within a school system, you can see teachers as essentially a developmental asset, right? And there's research that has shown that a strong teacher-student relationship can act as a buffer to build resiliency for kids who are experiencing adversity, trauma outside of school. And so when you think about play, right, those things can be fundamental to it. And so, if we think about physical education classes, or we think about recess, or we think about youth sport, or we think about after school and community programs, there can be an environment that is structured and predictable and allows kids to play in a way that can help facilitate their growth. Or there can be situations where it's like chaos and you don't know what to expect. If we think about the attachment piece, play is an incredibly powerful way for adults and children to bond. And so even if you think primary attachment within the home, one powerful thing that parents can do is like get on the floor and play with their kids, right? It helps build attachment. Teachers can do the same thing, right? Teachers can go out and play with their students. It helps build attachment and relationship that allows the student to see that adult as a safe and caring person whom they can then trust and depend on, which is essentially the building blocks of growth in terms of social and emotional development. A youth sport coach can provide that same level of support, right? Of connecting with children through play to provide that building block of growth and development. And so it's important for any child to have things like structure and predictability and routines and adults who they trust and are attached to. It becomes fundamentally vital to kids who are experiencing adversity and trauma at home, because those are kind of some of the very things that are being disrupted. And so I am a believer that we can use play, sport, physical activity, movement as a medium for those things that are essentially necessary for any kid, but vital for kids who are in rough situations. To rebuild
that broken attachment system?
Well, I wouldn't even say rebuild it, because one, I don't think the science is there, and two, I don't think we can ever substitute for like the need for primary attachment. But we know that things like healthy relationships with caring adults are vital for kids. And if we know that a kid has attachment disruption, it's even more important for them to be able to build trusting relationships. I think play is a great way to do it.
Yeah. To go back to the cause of it, why do you think people abuse kids? What do you think is at the core of what starts this whole cycle?
I think that's probably outside of my area of expertise.
Yeah.
There's certainly other people who would be better to ask. And, if we think about societal patterns, I think we get into a whole host of structural and systemic issues. I don't think that anybody sets out and says that like, oh, I'm going to abuse a kid, particularly a parent. But, if you take just the intersection of a host of societal factors that, isolate certain groups of people, dehumanize certain groups of people, systematically impoverish certain groups of people, consistently provide poor education to certain groups of people, consistently provide poor access to healthcare resources, food, nutrition. I think when you're living in a community that's riddled with community violence and it's all you grow up seeing, right? So if we start to look at the intersection of those things, a lot of times we probably find higher incidences of abuse across the spectrum.
Yeah.
And so not an easy or straightforward topic. I think by and large, if we think of parents in general, like parents are generally doing the best they have in the situation they're in.
Yeah.
And sometimes they are systematically more discriminated against and have barriers and things going on that might lead to difficult outcomes for children.
Yeah. And then do you think if someone is abused as a kid, that cycle goes up and they're more likely to be an abuser? And if so, how could they cut that cycle off?
Yeah, again, I would say not my area.
I'm going to ask you some questions outside a little bit.
And not something that I don't know that I'm qualified to comment on.
Okay. All right. So I guess I'm curious. Well, that kind of throws me for a loop. I guess how would you, if you could change the way that recesses are structured in the future, what are some changes that you think would help kids have more structure, but you can't overstructure because then again they feel like they're being controlled or they have a loss of control, so it's like a balance you almost have to strike?
Yeah, well, when we're talking specifically about recess, and I would say a lot of like play domains that are more structured, organized activities, certainly, is that there's this tension between, especially at recess, well, it's like the only time that their like day isn't structured and now you're going to structure that. There's a difference between structuring the environment and structuring the kids. And so you can take a playground and you can structure the environment, right? You can say like, this is where the jungle gym is. And like, so over here, like you can do like monkey bars and slides and whatever else, right? And like over here, like this is like the grassy area and we're going to set up a soccer field. And so like this is the area where if you want to play soccer, you play soccer. And like over here, this is the area if you want to play football, you play football. Yeah. And here, like here's all the jump ropes and the hula hoops. So if you want to play with those, like you do that here. So you can create a system where the environment is structured, where it's really clear of like, these are the things you can do here. And then these are the things you can do here, and these are the things you can do here. So that in no way is controlling what kids do or taking away their choice. It's just saying, here's some options. Here's the places you can do them. And so by structuring the environment, you can create a sense of predictability with kids, right? And you can even think like, okay, so you have recess at 11 and it's 10, right? If I'm a third grader, like I'm probably starting to think about what I'm going to do at recess. And so if I know like there's going to be a football game here and a soccer game here and jump ropes here and these kids generally do this, so I know they're probably going to be over there and these kids probably do that and they're going to be over there, I can start to plan and structure and have a sense of control and predictability in terms of what I'm going to do when I get out there, right? Yeah. It's comforting to know that I understand the environment before I get into it. So that's one small thing we can do.
Yeah, I assume bullying kind of throws a whole wrench in that entire thing. If someone follows you to whatever activity you do to bully you, I'm curious, so if you don't have an outlet for play because someone's bullying you, you're even experiencing trauma when you're supposed to be just living.
Sure. Well, let's talk about a few other things we can do in terms of a recess environment. Cool. Another thing that we see all the time in our data and certainly promote, but I understand that there's a tension, is that you see more positive outcomes when teachers are fully engaged in recess. And so there's a sense that like the adults at recess are there to supervise and monitor, right? So monitor behavior and supervise, which basically translates to like standing, overseeing very authoritatively. We see that kids are more engaged in play, that kids are more physically active, and that there's overall less conflict on the playground when the adults on the playground engage rather than supervise. And so by engage, like they hop in the game.
Why do you think kids want to play with adults?
Let me finish.
Okay.
Let me keep going.
Okay.
So when teachers play, when they jump in the game, and maybe not even jump in the game, but they facilitate the play, right? So maybe they're a lot of times, especially in different parts of the country, you might get like a 15-minute recess. And so like it's going to take 7-8 minutes for like the kids to get all the stuff out, get something set up, and get the game going. So one way teachers can engage is like to facilitate that process, right? Like help get the field set up while the kids are picking the team or whatever, so the play can start immediately. And so one of the things we see just naturally without like any type of specific intervention is that when teachers are playing alongside kids, that they're part of the game, that things like bullying, conflict, they just inherently decrease. And, I think there's probably a couple of reasons for that, but I think it also, it eliminates a environment that's built on hierarchies where like some people have all of the power and others don't. And so a lot of times what you see on playgrounds, like athletic boys are the top of the chain at recess. So they take like all the stuff and hog all the space. And then everyone else is just kind of like pushed out. And so you have kind of already like a built hierarchy of like who has the most power at recess. Mm-hmm. And so then if you're a kid who tries to like cross that, like it's very easy to see where bullying, fighting, conflict can occur. When you have adults kind of spaced out playing alongside the kids, it tends to help flatten those hierarchies because it doesn't allow any one group to get like a predominant amount of space, resources, and power.
Yeah. But hierarchies exist in the world.
They do.
Would you think, are you more of a proponent of keeping score in games or the newer method of where they don't keep scoring games and there's no winning?
It depends on the developmental level and the purpose. And so like, I coach youth sports. I like to win.
Yeah.
Like it's just a reality. Like keep score, you're trying to win. Even if you pretend that like winning doesn't matter, like the kids, if you're keeping score, they understand. But there's a developmental trajectory to that. And so, kids at 6, 7, 8, 9 years of age, like they generally don't care about winning. And I'm sure people would argue with me on that. But what they do is they adopt the values of the adults, right? And so like if we move this into a sports setting, if the coach is constantly like hammering on like how important it is to win, mm-hmm. You'll see kids like 8, 9 years old, they'll lose and they'll cry after the game because they're upset that they didn't win. If the coach is focused on having fun, developing your skill, working together as a team, like being resilient, not shutting down when things get hard, like you'll see kids like, they might lose, but like are happy and having fun after the game. Another thing you see at that age is like, the team might have lost like 20-3. But like if I'm a kid and I'm 8 and I went like 3 for 3 with 3 hits, like I'm pumped after the game because like I did well, mm-hmm. right? And so there's a developmental trajectory of effort and individual success. And so like on a broader scheme, I don't know how tied back this is into like the whole recess realm that we were talking about.
We're just having fun with it.
But if we think about development and individual development from a psychosocial standpoint through sport and games and through a like a technical and talent perspective, like those are important things. And we shouldn't just say like, oh, it doesn't matter. Like those things do matter. At the end of the day, at 8, 9, 10 years old, like winning really doesn't matter. Like it doesn't matter if you win the soccer game at recess. Like there are there's no life consequences. Mm-hmm. It matters that you learn how to win and learn how to lose, because I think those are important skills that we have. So going back to your question, like keep score. That's fine. Don't define yourself by it, or don't
project your values onto the kids.
Yeah. And if but it's important for kids to learn how to win and how to lose. Not even just how to lose, but like how to win. Mm-hmm. Like you don't want a kid who every time they win at something they like rub it in somebody's face. Like nobody wants to play with that kid, and then like eventually like nobody wants to be friends with that kid, and like nobody wants to hire that kid. Yeah. So you want to teach them the right way to do both. Mm-hmm. Inherent in that is keeping score. And knowing what the outcome is. And
so what would be the perfect outcome? If you were to take 2 adults, one of them had never played youth sports they had a coach who instilled poor values in them, and you had someone who had just the best sports coach, what would their lives look like?
It depends on so many more things than the coach. I would say that the biggest determining factor of what their lives look like is like one of them probably stops playing sports at 11 and the other one maybe plays, until their abilities allow them to, or develops it as a lifelong habit. Attrition rates for youth sport are pretty high and they skyrocket around like 11, 12 years old. It's the point at which developmentally most kids distinguish between ability and effort, who's good and who's not good. It's also, where a lot of adults probably project their values even more, right? And like winning becomes the sole focus. And, the coach prioritizes winning over player and person development. Well, if you're not the best on the team, like a lot of those kids are going to quit because they're having a miserable experience because they're only being rewarded and are punished based on like if they're producing a result. And certainly we see that starts in it at all levels of sport. But if you look at the psychological consequences to you're only good to me so long as like, you help us win. And like the message that sends to anyone, let alone a 10 or 11-year-old, can be just a devastating message.
Yeah. And do you think that message is the same across sports? Or what if you had a kid who's swimming and you maybe want him to progress past 11, but then you have another kid who's playing football? Would you really want them to keep playing football into high school with the risk of TBI being what it is?
I think those are just choices that parents and families are going to make. I mean,
you don't think there should be any rules around kids playing contact sports where they could be essentially messing up the rest of their life just because of playing a game?
I think that context is important. Like my kid doesn't play football; he plays flag football.
Yeah.
But like if we're getting into taking us into whole new terrain here,
I mean,
Tiger.
You're signing your kid up to be a gladiator, kind of, Like if you're really pushing and supporting your kid to be like a varsity football player and stuff like that. Not that it's wrong, but I'm curious how much of the kid's own volition comes into being like, I really want this, or just
Well, I think that's the heart of the question, right? Are you pushing your kid into doing something that you want them to do, or are you supporting them in doing something that they want to do, right? And so like, and I think oftentimes the former, where if you're pushing a kid into doing something that you want them to do, like oftentimes the outcomes aren't all that good, right? Or eventually it catches up, because the parent or the adult is more invested than the kid, and that just sets things up for problems, right? Yeah. Whereas if you're supporting kid and wanting to do something that has nothing to do with you, and you're supporting what they want, and so when you get to the point where they maybe say like, I don't want to do this anymore, right? There's no investment to where you're like, well, I've like poured my whole life into this, like you're going to keep doing it even though you don't want to. You see that all the time, right? Where parents get their kids into elite, sports at a young age, and they invest in personal coaches and equipment and tournaments and travel and all this, and then the kid hits 14 and doesn't want to do it anymore, and the parent says, but I've dumped all of this into it. Well, at what point was it about you, and what point was it about the kid? And so I think your answer is inherent in your question. Like, it depends. Are you pushing the kid into it, or are you supporting what they want to do?
Yeah, but I'm more, I guess you can't get rid of the game, but I'm curious if society should keep it an option for kids to, I mean, a high schooler, would you want your 15-year-old kid to be getting concussions?
You think you're talking specifically about tackle football?
Yeah, per se. I'm sure there's others. I mean, doesn't soccer have one of the highest concussion rates too?
Soccer has a pretty high concussion rate, and I think ice hockey has a fairly decent one. I think cheerleading has the highest of any. So like if we want to, have that conversation, a lot of times like we don't necessarily think of the sports is inherently with the highest concussion rates or the highest injury rates as the most dangerous. I think that certainly tackle football has its issues. I
guess where I'm coming from is a kid isn't super future oriented. They're not thinking, oh man, I might start developing Alzheimer's at 40 if I decide to do this. But you're being like, oh, they want to do it, I'll support them. Would it be better to be like, maybe like, hey, when you're 40, you'd be really thankful for not being quite as happy right now?
Well, I'll go back to what I said earlier. Parents have to make their own decisions.
Yeah.
And, like for my family, our current 10-year-old can play flag football. He can't play tackle football. He's asked maybe 5-6 times to play tackle football, and the answer is no. And like we tell him why, and he's 10, but we like educate him on the risk of concussions, and like we watch football, we watch college football, Saturdays in the fall, and but every once in a while when somebody really gets creamed or they need like an ambulance to come get him, like he's actually the one to point out like maybe like why are they playing if they know it's bad for their brains is like something he says, because clearly like we've said that over and over to him. So it's parents have to make their decisions. I don't think there's a right or a wrong decision. I think that it's football's done a lot of good things for a lot of people, and you talk to NFL players who might have brain damage, and some of are like severe, just like nagging injuries throughout their career, and a lot of them say they'd do it all over again if they had a choice, knowing what they know now. So I don't think you can just across the board say like this sport comes with a risk of injury, and so we should never do it, because I think that it's, as a sport, like any sport, I'm sure it's done a lot of good and a lot of bad, and you just have to make your decision on how you're going to do it.
I like it. So we've danced around it quite a bit, and you kind of brushed on it at the beginning, but I'm curious, how does play affect and shape the lives of youth?
I would say that, I would almost say like, how doesn't it, right? Because it's it's our base for so many things. Kids intrinsically and just inherently love to play, right? And so like if you think about yourself, right, like the friends you had growing up, like what do you remember about them?
Yeah, it tended to be during times of play.
Okay, so it's how we create social relationships, right? It's how it's often how we maintain those social relationships. If you think about just like being in the world, right, and however we want to define success, often on some level it's a function of the relationships we have and the connections that we make. And most often, I would argue that those are made through some form of play.
Yeah, I like that. And so if a kid's experienced trauma, and is there an integration period where they just don't want to play, and how would you gently encourage them to?
I think it can be a challenge. Trauma can manifest itself in all sorts of different ways. I think one of those is one in which people pull back and withdraw from things. And so particularly for young kids, I think it's really important to continue to give them an outlet in a place that they can feel is safe and supportive to be who they are, right? I think like when we talk about kids playing, like that's who they are. That's what they were meant to do. When we have situations where, like maybe some of that has been taken away, or maybe some of that just like innate love for movement and play has been taken away, then it does us well to think about how can we create scenarios to give some of that back.
Yeah. And so if you were to speak to youth who's experienced trauma right now, it's obviously super generalized, but what advice would you have for them?
I don't know that I would give any broad-based advice, because I think everybody's situation and scenario is different. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, I think all of us need to be surrounded by people that we can trust and people that will love and support us regardless of our circumstances. My background and training is one that just lends itself to studying that through the idea of sport and play, and that we can build those relationships there. Yeah. And so, to your first question, if I can do my small part in helping there, I'll try to. But, I would venture away from broad generalizations or advices like to the masses, because everyone's situation is different and we don't know what that is.
Yeah, but if you're speaking to someone who was abused in some way, and you could be like, all right, break the stigma, go find therapy, or go find physical therapy or whatever could, like what would be a start of a path that if they're helpless and they don't have any parents or teachers who will kind of help them?
It can. I think it depends. It depends on their scenario. It depends on what's happened. It depends on how they're coping with it. It depends on their biology and their environment and the access to resources they have. One of the things if we look at like the literature on trauma-based treatments, there's a range of things that show some level of effectiveness at kind of a broad level. But when you get down into the nitty-gritty, there's a lot of it where, especially when you're working one-on-one with a youth who's experienced trauma or has PTSD, it's you have to find what's going to work best for that person. And there's no broad guidelines that work best for everyone.
I like that. That's a whole lot.
Yeah.
Cool. It seems like every time I've ended these interviews, not that this is necessarily the end, but if you want to start thinking about if I've missed anything that you want to have said or talk about, feel free to interject it at any time. But I'm curious, is there a difference between chronic and acute? Like if you were just beaten once or somehow had one traumatic experience rather than your parents were impoverished and you had scarcity or food insecurity and stuff, do those manifest in different ways?
There's a difference in timing. The younger you are when, trauma or adverse childhood experiences is a lot of how the literature defines it. So the earlier you are when it happens, essentially the bigger risk you have. And so, if you experience trauma at 2 versus 24, you're much more likely to recover from it at 24 than you are at 2.
Does that go all the way back to birth? Like, do you think, I've heard a couple of things about it, like circumcision is just the first trauma any male would experience?
I don't know anything about circumcision, nor do I care to discuss it.
But that's all the way at the very back. That's a physical trauma they'd experience day one,
There's data that shows that essentially when you're still in the womb, I can't think of the technical term that we want there, but basically
utero?
In utero, and the mother is experiencing stress or trauma, that can manifest to the child.
So it can go all the way back.
It can go back to before you were born. There's actually some really fascinating research that came out of the University of Wisconsin a few years ago that shows a genetic link between the trauma of your parents and how that changes their essentially their biology and genetics, and how that is then passed down generations. And so there's research that look at epigenetics and how trauma can basically change how the environment activates your genes, and I think there's people showing that essentially those effects can carry down from your parents. So when we think about generational trauma, there's data to support the idea that it is kind of almost genetically handed down in a way.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure there's some positive benefits for that too. I'm completely going to misquote here, but something like if the parent experienced a famine between the ages of 6 and 12, their kids are less likely to be obese and things like that. They just develop there's a certain level of stress that's beneficial. You wouldn't want your kids to experience no stress in life, but too much stress becomes trauma.
So I think the whole idea that let's use trauma or adversity is good and can make you stronger. I would just try to get far away from that, mm-hmm. right? Yes, there's a beneficial level of stress, right? And there's things that trials and tribulations that make you stronger as a person. That should be fundamentally separated from the idea that you need to go through hardship as a child.
But
right?
some sort, like you can take a sauna and the heat stress causes heat shock proteins, or same with cold, cryotherapy and ice baths, and same with intermittent fasting. There's different stresses you can put on the body that physiologically help you. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that. But obviously overboard, you can die in a sauna.
Sure. So again, would you want your 3-month-old child to fast for health benefits? Probably not, right? Because they have a developing system.
Yeah.
adverse experiences in childhood are not a good thing. We should never think of them as a good thing.
Up until what age?
No child needs to experience neglect. No child needs to experience abuse. No child needs to experience famine. Yes, growth can happen from those.
But they need to experience exercise, and that's a stressor.
So again, that's a huge delineation between like something that is like a stressor, like
And a trauma.
and a trauma.
Yeah.
Right. And so like if we think about things that cause trauma, abuse, neglect, not being taken care of, having lack of attachment to a primary caregiver, having someone in your family die, having someone in your family go to prison, being raised by someone with mental illness who can't always care for you. Nobody needs to go through that. Nobody should go through that, and nobody's better for it. People might develop strengths because of their experiences, but that's not to say that those made them stronger. And in fact, all of the data we have would just strongly show that the more of those experiences you have, the more likely you are to experience a whole host of other risk factors.
Absolutely. Well, so I'm looking at this as a spectrum where at the far end is trauma and at the far end of the left side is inactivity completely. You never experience any sort of light things, and you want to find somewhere in the middle. Like if you had a kid who never got out and exercised and just ate plenty all day, like they never had any sort of stressors on the body, they also wouldn't. They'd grow up to be obese and all these,
Yeah, well, if you want to,
like everything's a
again, I would
spectrum.
separate those as, I wouldn't think of that as a continuum. I would think of those as two continuums,
Okay.
right? Like the idea of trauma and adversity in childhood is incredibly different than the idea of daily stressors, right? Like everybody needs to fail, right? Like let's say you fail a test, like that's stressful. You learn from it, you grow. Like there's no path to success that does not lead through failure. And failure obviously comes with some sort of stress, right? And we need stress to function in our lives. Like, if there's not enough stress, it's preventative to like doing things like getting a job or going to school or, playing sports. All of those things come with stress, but those are fundamentally different than what we would think about in terms of adversity and trauma, because what we're fundamentally talking about there is our basic needs, right? And are they getting met, right? And so neglect happens when like our basic need for appropriate care is not there, right? When we don't have the food we need or the shelter we need or the love and companionship that we need. Abuse happens. It's a violation of our need for safety, whether it's physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, right? It's taking a fundamental need of safety and trust and security away. Disrupted caregiving is taking away a fundamental need to have a primary caregiver that we're bonded with, that we're connected with, that we know will keep us safe. Those are different fundamentally than stress, right? Like we don't have like a fundamental basic need to like pass every test we take or to like sit on the couch if we want to be lazy. So that's where I would separate. Like those are different continuums, and I think we run a really big risk of doing fundamental damage when we conflate those. And when we say that, like, adversity is adversity and you should get some of it, right? And then you get into like, let's go youth sport, right? And you have coaches that are very abusive because it's good for kids, right? It'll make them tougher and stronger. Like, it won't. Yeah. Like, yelling and screaming and shaming and like verbally and or physically abusing a kid in sport to like make them tougher or more resilient, like it's not going to work. It's going to do harm. And so I think when we look at those as one continuum, we very much run the risk of stepping into that harm zone.
Okay, so if you separate them as continuums, I'm curious, how do you develop a growth mindset in a kid so when they experience failure, they don't see it as something bad? Because I'm sure if a coach yells when they fail, that immediately shuts it off and says, this is a bad thing, I should view it as a bad thing.
Sure, it's developmental. It has a lot to do with parenting. It has a lot to do with, certainly some kids are going to have different dispositions, but the environments that we're in and the environments that children are in are going to have a huge impact on growth versus a fixed mindset. So like one thing, if you think about kids, I say this with all the best of intentions. Kids are easy to manipulate, right? Like one way or the other.
Yeah.
And so like you could take like a 3-year-old, right? And maybe they saw like basketball on TV and they shoot like a paper towel wad in the trash. And they're like, oh, I made it. Yeah, right. Like, and you could be like, no, you idiot, you did it wrong. Like, that was terrible. That was stupid, right? And so now, like, that kid is going to start to get into, like, and let's just say, like, you repeat that pattern all the time, right? So that kid's going to start to see, like, everything they do as a failure, fear failure, be afraid to try things, be afraid of the consequences of things because you've socialized them to do so, right? Let's say like same kid, like you like check out of the corner of your eye, like they throw the paper towel at the basket, miss by 5 feet. And you're like, oh man, buddy, like that was awesome. Like you made basketball and a hoop yourself. Like, great initiative. Like grab it, try it again, see if you get closer this time. Right. So now the kid's going to start to learn that taking chances is a good thing. There's no reason not to. Like, why not take a chance? You get closer the next time. And so, like, kind of an extreme example, but like if you repeated those patterns across time, those kids would start to internalize that, right? And so if you think about, if we go to U Sport, like the coach has a huge impact on the environment and kind of the motivational environment and how kids view success and failure, because what you reward as a coach, particularly for young kids, right? So we're talking like 10 and under, they're gonna, like 85% of them are gonna adopt to that, right? So as a coach, let's just say, so we'll go like broadly, we'll go like vaguely from real life examples, but we'll generalize them a little bit. Yeah. Let's just say like you make the focus of like playing together as a team, supporting your teammates and doing your best, right? And like that's all you focus on, that's all you reinforce. Somebody makes a mistake, you encourage them to focus on the next one, right? Kids are going to adopt that. And it's not going to matter if they win or lose. Like that's not going to define who they are. It's not going to define their season, right? They're going to think about, did I have fun? Did I make new friends? Did I get better? If you look at the literature, right, and you ask kids, like young kids, why they play sports, like that's why they play. Like the number one reason is almost always to have fun, and then it's to like connect with their friends or teammates. It's to get better. Like winning is normally like 13th, 14th, 15th on the list, right? It's not what they think about. But if you as the coach, the person that they look up to, it's all you talk about, that's all you care about. We got to win. It doesn't matter like how, and then you get into scenarios where like you're benching 9-year-olds because they made a mistake and like they're costing you the win, right? Which is great for their self-esteem, being very sarcastic there for anyone in your listening audience. Yeah. But it happens all the time. See it all the time. Coach like screams and yells at a kid for making a mistake. Or you get like, I coach baseball, so you get the coach yelling like throw strikes. It's like, yeah, he's trying. Like he knows he's not supposed to throw balls. Yeah. But then the kids are going to adapt that, right? The only goal they're going to focus on is winning. And when it doesn't happen, they're going to be devastated because it's what the person in charge cares about. Now, when you get to like 14, 15-year-olds, like at the end of the day, they're going to want to win. Developmentally, that's where they're at. But you can still focus the environment to say, okay, well, what are the things that are important to winning, right? Like we're not going to win if we're not focused, and we're not going to win if we don't make the routine plays, and we're not going to win if we don't support each other. And so you can still put the focus on those things, and you can use those things as drivers, as how you measure success, because they set you up to win anyway. Yeah. But at the end of the day, like you'll have kids who will be disappointed if they don't win. But you're not creating that win at all cost, win no matter what. It's the only thing that matters. If you think of sports in general, like most people will lose most of the time. Like that's a reality. At the end of the season, whatever your sport is, everybody's a loser but one team. And so like if you make that your only benchmark, you're setting people up for failure. So back to like, how do you create a growth or a fixed mindset? Like focus on the things that are controllable. Focus on getting kids to understand that okay, like maybe that team beat us and they were better than us today, but that doesn't mean if we don't do like X, Y, and Z over the next 3 months that we can't be better than them, right? That continues the idea that we can grow, we can improve, we can get better, versus like, well, we lost and so it doesn't matter anymore. They're better than us. There's no point in trying anymore.
I like that. So what I'm kind of getting from this is that play and sport are a good time to instill morals into a kid because they're malleable at that age, and growth fixed mindset and things like winning, losing are possibilities. What are some of the main morals that you push if you get a group of youth?
Yeah. So to your point, right, sport often does create a sense of like, we'll call it a moral compass. Hopefully like parents are doing that more than the sport setting, but sport creates values. We'll say that, right? But those can be good or bad, right? We talk about like, sport can create character. Like that's a thing people say, right? Like it can, bad character and good character, right? So like sport can create little monsters that are, just difficult and
know their kids want to play with them.
Or can instill valuable life lessons. And so, like for me personally, it's I always keep it pretty simple in practice. It's support your teammates, like number one. Like look for the positive. One of the things, like when talking to younger kids and coaching, and it's like, okay, like who here has never made a mistake in sport? Like who's here is perfect, right? Raise your hand. And like inevitably, like the one jokester will raise his hand and like, oh, really, never. But like nobody can say that. And so it's like, all right, so like when your teammate messes up, like they will, because all of you will. Like, how would you want to be treated if you made a mistake? Would it be helpful if we all yelled and screamed at you and told you that you sucked? Or would it be helpful if we said like, hey, let's get the next one. I got your back, right? And so we create a culture around like how to support your teammates. So it's one thing to say, like, be a good teammate. It's another thing to lay out definitively what that means for them and then how we need to act on a daily basis, right? So I think like that's one. Another one is, like essentially like giving your best that you have that day. And so like, again, it's like be here, be present. Don't be talking to people in the stands because you're not giving your team your best right now, which gets into like important skills of like being focused on the task at hand. Supporting those who are around you. So, really for me, it's a lot of social skill development, how to be a part of a group, how to be a part of a team, how to play a role on a team. It might not always be the role that you want. Like not everybody can play the position they want. And so, but I think it's important when you're coaching kids, like you talk to them about that, right? Like, as coaches, like we're going to decide if, who's going to help fill what role, and certainly you can have some say in that and what you want, and we'll rotate things around and give people chances. But like part of learning how to be on a team is maybe like doing the thing you don't want to do as much. And I think that's a valuable life skill, because if we have a bunch of people who like either like I do what I want or I do nothing, well, like that's not a functional attitude for the real world.
Give them a little perspective that it's not forever. So it sounds a lot like you reward positive behavior and you don't de-incentivize, like you don't punish bad behavior. So I'm curious, how do you deal with? So you set out a good layout of here are our morals, here's what we expect, and a kid's purposely just throwing a wrench in the whole thing. How do you help facilitate that to be a better situation?
Yeah, I think like punishment is like generally not all that effective. Holding people accountable to the standard you set is, right? So there's a difference between like punishing someone and holding them accountable to a standard, right? And so like if we're talking youth sport, that's what we're talking about, right? Yeah. Then a lot of times like what's inappropriate is to punish a kid for making a bad play. Okay, so like kid misses a shot in basketball, kid strikes out in baseball, and they get yelled at or benched or whatever else, right? Like, so to me, that's completely inappropriate. One, because like it goes back to the idea of you're just promoting like a fixed mindset, right? That like
you're as good as you are.
You're as good as you are, and then your only value is like what you can produce. so, to me, that's where you really, as a coach, need to be technical in terms of like, okay, like you missed because you did this, this, and this. So next, this is what we need to work on. But also encouraging, like you can get better. We will do better. In terms of behavior, proactively. So you set up what your expectations are, right? And so like I coach baseball. My kids know you argue with an umpire, you're on the bench. You say something negative to your teammate, you're on the bench. It's not punishment. It's we've proactively laid out, here's the expectation. If you failed to meet the expectation, here's what the consequences are.
And you're consistent with it. Just because your best player argues with the umpire, you can't give
Yeah.
him an exception.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that.
And that's when kids figure it out, is when, and it happens, right? Usually it's not an umpire. Usually it's like they say something negative to a teammate, right? And it's like, or like they're talking to someone in the stands during a game. And it's like, hey, you're out. Have a seat, right? Mm-hmm. And then you make it really clear as to why. I think it's important that everybody knows, right? Like,
Not
you're
because
out
I said so.
because like you did this,
Yeah.
right? And then everybody goes like, ooh, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think you do have to make that example sometimes with your best player, to say like, you're no different than anyone. And like at the end of the day, if we lose the game because you were on the bench because you were being rude to a teammate, like we'll take that because you learning how to be a good teammate is more important than winning a game at 11 years old.
So to take this one step further, maybe kids who have experienced trauma come and they are preventing everyone else from playing effectively, like they're just walking around the field or throwing stuff down, and you can't exclude them from the game because that just makes things worse. How do you properly incorporate them in?
Yeah, so I think a lot of times that the structures and supports you create help shape how kids behave and act, right? And so it goes back to that idea of creating predictable systems. A lot of times kids will act out because they don't feel safe, right? Because they don't feel supported. So first, I think it's good to like proactively add those things in, right? So like having a routine to your practice, so they know like when we get here, like this is what we do first, this is what we do second, like having an order to things, right, is incredibly helpful, and proactively getting rid of some of those behaviors. Having a lot of like player-led type things, right? So it's not like there's kind of an order and a structure, but then within that, it's like, so, we're always going to start with the warm-up first, and like this is what the warm-up is, but then like players are going to lead it and they're going to rotate leading it. And, so creating those systems and structures, I think helps proactively. The other thing is that I think in some respects, right, so you set those expectations, you make it incredibly clear what they are and what the consequences are. And let's say you have a kid who's just like, throwing rocks at somebody.
Yeah.
So how you handle that is really important. Same consequence or same, held to expectation, right? So if like you're being a bad teammate, like you're going to sit out, like that's normally, like I come from it. One, I don't like to make kids run or do physical activity as like a
punishment.
Punishment or like lack of meeting expectations, because then it's just associated with something bad.
Yeah.
Like I come at it with the mindset of like kids are there because they want to play.
Mm-hmm.
So like the best thing to do to hold them accountable is not let them play, right? But it's how you do that. So if I scream like, like get the hell out of here, go sit over there, that's like isolating, shaming, whatever. If I walk up, put my arm around a kid, say, we're going to go sit on the bench together, we're going to have a talk, right? And just say like, listen, I can't have you out there because right now it's not safe for everybody. So like, what's going on? What are you doing? Like, how can we support you? Still holding that expectation. Everybody else sees them holding the line. If you're not being safe, if you're not being a good teammate, you're going to be out. But how I do that is going to be different, or how a coach is doing that is going to be different individually. And I think it's important to know, who your kids are, who you're coaching. Like for some kids, you can just be like, dude, go have a seat, right?
Yeah.
For others, it might be like, come on, let's go. We're going to sit down for a little bit. We need to figure this out.
Mm-hmm. You said something really important there, which is not to de-incentivize using activity, because then they maybe grow up thinking, oh, running's a bad thing. They associate with that bad thing. Or you did something wrong, go to sit in your room for a while, and then they associate their room with punishment. I guess that's something not a lot of people think about. I'm curious, does that come into other facets of, like what are your thoughts on what not to use and what to use?
I think it has to be like a natural thing, right? Like it doesn't make sense. Let's say like you miss a ground ball in baseball and then like you have to run a lap. Like there's no connection to missing a ground ball and running a lap, right?
Yeah.
Like running is not going to improve your ability to get the next one. And so I think anytime that action and consequence to action are disconnected, it doesn't help kids learn the way that it should. Now, if you're if you're like being unsafe, like a natural reaction would be then to remove you from the situation, right? And so, that might be like for a kid in a house, right? That might be going to the room because it's removing them until they have the time and space to calm down. I think framing it is important, right? If it's like, go to your room because like you're in trouble and nobody wants to be around you, that could create a negative connotation around it. If it's like, you need some time to calm down and take a break, and when you're ready to, re-enter society in a calm and productive manner, like you're free to come out, right? And so I think same thing in sport, right? Like, hey, you're not meeting the expectation right now, or you're not being supportive of your teammates. So like, I'm going to need you to step out of this. And when you're ready, like to re-enter in a way that meets the expectations, we'll check in, talk, make sure you're there, and then you'll re-enter. So I think also like leaving it somewhat open-ended to say, like, we're going to remove you from this situation right now because it's not safe for you or for someone else. And when you feel like you're ready to come back, you let me know. Yeah. It gives them the power, right? It's saying, like, yeah, there's an expectation, and if you don't meet it, there's a consequence. But like, you still have control in this situation. When you're ready, let me know.
On the flip side of that, I'm sure the way that you incentivize also has a lot to do with how people progress in life. Like, say they won and everyone was a really good teammate and stuff, and then you're like, all right, let's go out for pizza, cake, ice cream, McDonald's or something. That would show them that unhealthy foods and stuff are a benefit, and then when they get older and they can just buy at any time, they maybe develop an unhealthy relationship with that. So what do you think are good ways to promote things, just like social or?
Yeah, so from a general stance, really anything that you can do that's more internally satisfying than externally satisfying is going to be a better way to promote it, right? So like rewarding by like promoting feelings of pride and success and joy and reinforcing like the fun of it, right? It's going to be more lasting anyway than like going to grab ice cream, right? Yeah. So if you like, as a reward for whatever, like go and get ice cream, that's only going to last so long, right? Like at some point, like the idea of going out and getting ice cream is no longer going to serve as a motivator, particularly if you can just like go out and buy it yourself as like kids get older. And so promoting those things that are more internal in terms of like why they do it in the first place is going to make it more lasting and sustainable anyway. Now that said, particularly with kids, like I also think it's good to celebrate sometimes. And like sometimes it is good to go out for ice cream. Yeah. Maybe not McDonald's, never McDonald's. But certainly like, there's times to celebrate too.
Yeah. Once that motivation's been changed from say you're teaching kids when you're leading their youth baseball team and you really intrinsically motivate them, and then next year your leg's injured, you can't teach them, and the guy's just extrinsically motivating them, like, yeah, we go to ice cream every time, and then you come back the following year and everyone's extrinsically motivated. Is it possible to change that backward?
Yeah, I mean, it's work. I think that it's one of the things that, so I'm going to go in a little bit of a different direction, but one of the things that I think should be your goal as a youth sport coach is that like the kid comes back and plays next year, right? Like I think you've done a good job as a coach if your kids still want to play at the end of the year, right? And that shows that you've really promoted more of like an internal sense of love for the game or the sport or whatever it is, right? If kids want to come back, that's like, you probably did something well. If they're in a system where they're just like used to getting rewarded for everything, I think like it depends on the age, but young kids adapt pretty quickly, right? So like the first couple of weeks there'd probably be like can we do this? Can we get this? Can we get that? And like after a while, like they'll just realize they can't, and like they'll stop asking. But I also think that, when they realize like when you're reinforcing fun as like a motivator, right? Like who doesn't want that?
Mm-hmm. All right, I like that. It seems like every question I ask you have these super, you've well researched the body of knowledge that you're kind of based on. I'm curious if you have any thoughts.
Sometimes when you ask me about, things outside of my...
Yeah, but within your realm, do you have any questions that you don't have answers for, that you're like just kind of pet thoughts that you're like, I wonder where this would go, and there just isn't the knowledge to support them yet?
I think most of my questions I don't really have answers to. I probably have a lot of ideas. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately in terms of where to go and where there's not a lot of research on, it kind of ties back to what you were asking about in the beginning. And that's particularly related to schools, but thinking about trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive physical activity spaces, right? And so the big ones are physical education classes and recess. And so, if we think about, the data shows that trauma and adverse experiences in childhood are more prevalent than like any of us would have thought before, right? Like it's everywhere. And so how do we design a playground? How do we design a physical education curriculum that is supportive of the kid who's likely coming into that environment, who's affected by trauma? I think traditionally, those two spaces, I think, again, physical activity has huge benefits across multiple domains, right? For mental health, for social health, obviously there's physical health ramifications, right? And so like there's benefits to moving. But when we think about the kids who sit out, who don't move, oftentimes there are other factors going on. And so like I think there's been some like a little bit of growing work around like physical education and like the LGBTQ youth community, right? And so like generally PE has not been like a warm and welcoming space for those individuals. And so how do we create it to where it is more sensitive to maybe like trauma or abuse or stereotypes that people have experienced? When I think about that for recess, it's a lot of it, I think, is kind of what we're already thinking about in terms of what does a quality playground look like. I don't think that, like oftentimes if you think of what would be good for an individual affected by trauma, like the answer is inevitably what would be good for everybody, right? It's not like you have to design something that's trauma informed and then that takes away from everyone else. Really, like what it does is just enhance everyone else's experience, is what I would argue. But it's, like, how do we create an environment that's predictable and easy to manage? How do we create an environment where adults can be relational and allies for students? How do we create an environment where social hierarchies don't dominate to where some are excluded and some are given all of the privilege? And so thinking about that has been, the past little bit, just kind of diving into the literature to think about what we know about biology and physiology and environments and different interventions in other spaces, and how might we transform that into one in which we put it into a recess context, a PE context, a youth sport context, because at the end of the day, in probably 99% of schools and 99% of youth sport leagues, you're going to have kids who are affected by trauma. And so how do we create an environment that will allow them to thrive rather than like constantly pushing them down?
Yeah. And so this is pretty downstream. Have you thought of any upstream approaches for how to create a world where trauma in youth is less prevalent?
It's above my pay grade, Tiger. I think as long as we have a world in which humans exist in it, like we're going to have a world that is broken with problems. And certainly there's larger societal systematic efforts that probably need to take place around wealth disparities and income inequality and education disparities and inequalities and health disparities and inequalities.
Something really interesting I heard about that from Professor Godsod, a evolutionary biologist, was he asked me, he was like, what do you think is the primary indicator of abuse in a house, childhood abuse in a household? And you'd obviously think it would be socioeconomic stress, right? Just financial troubles would kind of spur it, but it's actually having a step parent in the household. And I mean, you obviously can't change that. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on. I mean, just you can't even unpack
thoughts.
that. No thoughts. All right. Did I miss anything on? I kind of a while ago I prompted you if you had any thoughts or things you once said.
No, I don't think so.
Cool. All right. I appreciate your time. Thank you, and looking forward to hearing your talk on the what are you doing with the DC thing?
Oh, in a couple of weeks, recording for the National Parent-Teacher Association, talking about holistic education, particularly how recess can be a place of social development, or, as we discussed, a place of non-social development.
Yeah, creating good morals and setting people up to be better members of society.
Sure, yeah.
All right, I appreciate it. If you liked it, subscribe, find him on Twitter and stuff like that. I appreciate your time.
All right, thanks, Tiger.
Thank you.